Endbreach by Nicholas Woode-Smith. Performed by Scott Miller. Produced by Citadel Studios for Sentinel Creatives. Shrapnel tore into Gudradd's center unit. He could no longer smell the iron and fiery discharge of the black fire cannons. He was encased only in his own stench, the reminder of his inevitable death. Fitting, for every squogg was doomed to die. The only choice they had was how, and better by fire than rot, always. And so Gudradd charged into the breach, weapon in hand. Rot was all he smelled. Smoke, ash, and the blasts of human munitions was all he saw. And he heard an end, promised to him, promised to all squogg. Rot or fire. He had chosen fire. Nobody knew who fired first. This wasn't a formal war. No casus belli. No declarations. Only orders to fire at will. Rallying cries to oust the invaders. But what were they invading? And weren't these their lands? Revenge? Perhaps. But revenge for what? Gudradd didn't know, but he didn't ask. He was squogg. Squogg knew their place, and his place was manning a gunnery in the cold death of a Cyro, dreadnought of Black Fleet Flotilla 353. It had been his father's place before him, and his father's before that. Gudradd did not pay attention during his digi-acclimation session on history, so he did not know how many generations the cold death went back. The only indicator of his home ship's age was lighter patches of metal, where breaches had been replaced by whatever alloys could be formed in the local systems. The cold death was a motley hybrid of metals from 100 systems, and a survivor of countless wars. And if Gudradd had been inclined to ask, the Warmeister of the ship would also not have known how long the cold death had been drifting in the blackness of space, and would not have known how many times it had faced war. But both Gudradd and the Warmeister knew one thing. War had come again. And it was announced with a deafening boom and scream of metal, as a scorching shell was sent across light years, propelled by warp drives and guided by enemies that would be blinking into existence at any moment. The quaking of the ship was followed by sirens and blinking lights, and Gudradd was shaken out of his reverie by his bunkmate. Through the dirty brown-amber embalm fluid, he watched a large figure stare down at him. This wore only the head-to-toe underskin of a squogg. He had not donned his armor or utility skin yet. Gudradd was not much better. The embalm fluid began to drain away as a pair of goggles were vacuum sealed over Gudradd's eyes. He still had eyelids and nerves in that part of his face, so could feel as the teeth of the goggles bit in and sealed shut onto his flesh. He saw the figure in more detail now and tried to recall his name. Was it Pitchkin? Irika? No, can't be them. Pitchkin was offed by peg pirates, visor ripped off by a gas chain. Gudradd saw his eyes and flesh pulled out of the underskin hole like shredded sausage. Irika got off easy. He'd been assigned to Black Fleet 257. They were scouring Galactic Northeast, far away from humans who knew how to fight back. Gudradd envied Irika. Not the lack of fighting. Gudradd did not know what lack of fighting meant, but he envied that Irika was stationed so close to the true home. Even if his old bunkmate never got the chance to touch down on true home, he would at least be within its vicinity. Closer than most squogg ever would have the chance. Gudradd's embalming pod augmented upwards, forcing him to stand as leftover fluid fell through into grating to be recycled. Pins stuck into his underskin, and he felt his soggy, life-maintaining suit fill with fresh embalm fluid. It wasn't as potent as the pod stuff, but this thinner goo would allow him to move around with relative ease.
Humans,
the figure spoke, guttural, deep and through a crackling transmitter. Gudradd would remind him to get this in-tone mic or speakers fixed after the battle, if there was an after. Gudradd examined his bunkmate as his suit was full. He remembered.
Tigron,
Gudradd said triumphantly, recalling the name of the squogg who helped him on the gunnery. Gudradd primed the charges, while Tigron manned the munition rails.
I hear the humans don't man their own gunneries,
Tigron said, glancing and twitching with every thud and distant rallying cry.
Cowards, xenophiles,
Gudradd replied.
They will let other races do their work for them. The height of dishonor. They don't deserve death.
Tigron bleated with his broken transmitter, signaling his agreement. The normal beep came out as a cracked warble. Gudradd hoped it wouldn't get in the way of the mission. Gudradd's underskin was filled up like a balloon. He took a step and felt the slosh of gel. It would be sinking into his pores, staving off the flesh plague. He'd gone only a moment without his embalm suit, his underskin, in his entire life. That was when he had been born. His father told him that he had marvelous, smooth, unblemished skin upon birth. For just a few seconds. But like all squogg, it only lasted for seconds. His skin began to wrinkle moments before he was placed in a vat of the dirty brown amber, and then given his own suit. Throughout his time on Blackfleet 353, he had gone through 3 suits, and thus was his age denoted, third skin. And if he was unlucky, he'd have to live with the flesh plague for many more skins. Void forbid that he lived long enough for his 12th skin, like the Warmeister. Gudradd and Tigron turned at the sound of heavy, metal-clad footfalls. They were charging down the hallway, its usual brown metal walls stained with the flashing dark blue of the emergency sirens.
If only we could have the honor of an Endbreach,
Tigron said, as he turned to check the straps on his underskin.
It is not our time,
Gudradd responded.
The time for fire is not here for us, but we can deliver fire on the enemy. Without us, there is no Endbreach. Be proud, fleet friend, for without us, there would be only the rot to blind and take us away.
Tigron warbled his broken bleat again.
Blackfire cannon Akron 23 was malfunctioning during bombardment through the last awakening,
Tigron added, as Gudradd finalized his last suit checks.
The other awakenings would have fixed it,
Gudradd assured him. He couldn't be sure, however. He had never met anyone outside of his awakening, his shift. Even during their last skirmish with the human trooper armada, and even with a large fleet battle with Imperial forces off Grandmond, the other awakenings were absent. Gudradd wondered how many battles and chances for an end he'd missed, just because he was refilling his embalm fluid. Could he have had the honor of an Endbreach? He had never fired a Black Lance before, but that didn't matter. When it came to an Endbreach, it was not about delivering the enemy from suffering. It was about finally overcoming the rot. Fire. Gudradd sniffed. His center unit was picking up fire.
Let us hurry,
Tigron said, finally putting on his indoor ship shoes and locking them onto the stumps of his underskin. Gudradd did the same, and they vacated their room. A cacophony of guttural squogg speak and the scent of blackfire cannons, the sickly sweet smell of embalm fluid, and the hot grating of metal overwhelmed Gudradd's center. His head swam for just a second, but then he got his bearings and caught up to Tigron. The shorter squogg was outpacing even some of the taller fighters preparing for the Endbreach. Gudradd managed to catch up, his ship shoes clanging even over the sounds of preparations for war and the occasional secondary bombardment from a system away.
Faster, Gudradd. We must let loose a volley before the warriors get all the honor.
Gudradd bleated in response, and the two of them dropped down a grab chute, landing near their gunnery. Inside, the other squogg who shared their awakening and position were waiting.
How many humans?
A newbie asked Tigron, as they made their way to their station. Gudradd punched his key into the primer console as Tigron replied.
Endbreachers, glory to them. Glory to them. Said something about 12 frigates and a cruiser. We'll crush them and give them undeserved fire.
Dugresh, one of the fellow crewmen, added, bleating his joy. Gudradd had to agree. Black Fleet 353 tripled that number. Why would the foolish humans engage them now? Another shell rocked the ship.
Stations!
Dugresh shouted, falling into his position by the group trigger for all the guns in the gunnery. Gudradd moved into position by his console. Orange lettering fell over a black screen, feeding Gudradd data about the state of the Blackfire shells at their disposal.
Orders!
Dugresh shouted, acting as a supervisor. His father had been a gunnery supervisor, and Dugresh had inherited the role in spirit.
2 enemy frigates spotted on starboard.
The newbie on the superscope stated.
Prime charges.
Gudradd traced his finger across the screen, selecting all the guns in use. Once confirmed, he twisted his console key further to confirm.
Charges set. Loading. Smaller vessels sallying from the frigates. Requesting firing privileges. Privileges given. Brace. Fire!
Dugresh pushed a lever forward with more force than needed, and his actions were followed by the sequential boom, boom, boom of Blackfire cannons, leaving the hint of overwhelming cordite and sulfur to invade Gudradd's center.
Report. Volley off by 3 degrees. Destroyers hit. More frigates warping in. The lighter fury engaging off the starboard bow at around 400 kilometers. Adjust. Aim. Get the next volley ready.
Before he could finish, there was a sudden rush of vacuum from the direction of the grav chute.
Breach.
A crewman yelled. He smacked a lever down, and the vacuum stopped.
They've hit us, my fellow squawk. Are we gonna let them go unanswered?
The crew bleated loudly in response, chiming in with Tigron's warble.
Give them fire.
Gudradd primed the next volley and, within moments, it was fired into the blackness.
Report.
Dugresh repeated.
Ship pivoting. Scope out of range. The lighter fury will deal with them. My fat brother had his fire on that ship. They will end the Takroon scum.
Gudradd readied himself to prime the next batch as Dugresh waited for the new orders by the Warmeister.
Orders.
Dugresh repeated, as he had done so in many other engagements.
6, 8 frigates in sight.
The newbie reported.
More than predicted.
Tigron said.
No matter. Prime charges. Primed. Load.
Clicks, thuds, and the slide of the shells inside their titanic barrels.
Requesting. Granted. Fire.
In sequence again, and again, each cannon fired. Even Akron 23. The previous awakening had fixed it up. Upon the 6th volley, the newbie gave a different report.
Frigates moving. No. Warping. They're charging for warp jump. Rapid fire. Don't let them escape. They're not retreating.
Dugresh stopped. The newbie looked up, and Gudradd could see him shivering even through his underskin.
Warp ram in 3. Brace. Brace.
Dugresh boomed. Gudradd grabbed the railings of his console just in time as he watched Tigron catapulted across the room. Ankron 23 was bent out of its socket, ripping into the inner hull and spilling its unshot volley into the crew area. Alarms blared, indicating to the crew that something was very much wrong, if the dead crewman and crack in the side of the ship hadn't made that apparent already.
Prepare the next volley,
Dugresh ordered, not missing a beat.
Breachers aboard, 2 floors up. Leave that to the warriors. We will get our fire in time. Give them what we have first.
The crew, Gudradd included, bleated in unison. Gudradd glanced towards his bunkmate's corpse, twisted and spilling amber fluid onto the metal floors. He looked to be dead on impact. The rot hadn't ended him. Gudradd was happy for him.
Frigates covering a destroyer formation. Fire! 3 hit, 1 down. We serve not just the cold death today, my fleet friends and battle brothers,
Dugresh said, standing at his console and pointing at Gudradd, signaling for him to prime the next volley.
We serve Blackfleet, not the 353, but the entire endless flotilla. We know the meaning of rot and fire, and even if our mortal foes will not ever suffer our skin-born curse, they will know our fire. We will deliver them what we deserve, and in time they shall return the favor. Load! Loaded! Fire!
Boom, boom, boom.
These humans know not their blessings, but we shall help them understand. They do not rot, but they must still end, and we shall be their end.
Gudradd primed the charges.
Enemy fleet thinning, light of fury, and a flotilla of numbered ships are routing them. Do not relent. Prime charges.
Dugresh paused and read something on his console.
Unprime. Sir? There is an Endbreach there. We shall not intervene. We wait the pivot. Rest your rotting limbs.
Nobody argued. While they envied and desired an Endbreach themselves, they would not take it from their comrades in the other ships. They had earned it. The rot would end. Fire would engulf them, and those who survived would have victory as a consolation.
The War Master reports inevitable victory. These humans engaged Blackfleet petulantly, and we put them down. The breach above is being patched. Do not be disappointed. The time for your Endbreach and fire will come, just not today. There are more volleys to be had, and much more.
Dugresh was flung from his seat, smacking his head into his console as the ship lurched and suddenly engaged its rapid-turning thrusters. The newbie rushed towards Dugresh, whose forehead was dripping a mixture of amber embalm fluid and oozing black blood. He lifted himself up while the newbie applied a sealant patch to the crack in his underskin. Groggy, he looked around and then at his console. Whatever he saw shook him out of his reverie. The newbie recoiled at the display as Dugresh flailed about to get back in his chair.
Enemy reinforcements. Prepare a volley. No. Sir?
The newbie asked.
353 is retreating. The Curs were hiding behind that gas giant, an armada of them. They meant to trap us. We have minutes to warp.
The surviving crew looked down, disappointed. They would not reach their end. Just delay it. Delay it and risk the rot.
But, oh glory.
Dugresh stood up and pointed at Gudradd.
Prime charges. Loaders, get ready. Prepare the next volley. We're holding the rear.
Gudradd's eyes widened in his sealed goggles. The rear guard. They wouldn't get time to escape, which meant, at the end of this, Squogg didn't smile. They didn't know what a smile was. But if they did, Gudradd would have beamed. The promised end. Promised to all Squogg. And it would be fire. The newbie made his way back to the superscope as the ship was thrummed with the impact of enemy munitions while simultaneously firing their own volleys of Armageddon-wreaking blackfire shells.
Wada, Deezer, open the breach lockers,
Dugresh ordered.
Prime the next volley. Load. Brace. Fire.
Wada and Deezer made their way toward the back of the gunnery, where they opened a series of lockers that were accessed from the black and brown metal walls. Inside were black lancers, enough and more to arm the crew. Gudradd could barely contain his excitement. He looked at Tigron's splayed corpse. He had gone already and met his end, but he would have enjoyed the glory. That much Gudradd did know about him.
We have more volleys in us, but arm yourselves for the final stand. The end has come, my battle brothers, my fellows in rot. We shall be consumed this day, by fire, by righteous warfare, and we shall know the end and rise up to where the flesh plague will not, cannot touch us.
Gudradd heard a small sob in Dugresh's voice, not one of despair, or perhaps just a bit. Death was unknown. The unknown was full of terrors, but no more terrors than the rot of life. Gudradd looked upon his oncoming death with unbounded anticipation.
I am honoured to have served alongside such squogg, and I will be honoured for us all to find our ends together. Fire the last volley.
Gudradd, his hands shaking with excitement, primed the last volley and leant back as it was fired. Boom, boom, boom. It would be the final time that Gudradd would hear it. The glory of Blackfire. Would he miss it? He didn't know. He grasped his black lance. It stuck on the ground, the barrel flare reached up to his navel. He held it with 2 hands. Dugresh stood up and held his.
Hold the black lance with 2 hands. Nestle the stock into your shoulder, like this.
The crew copied him. Gudradd felt the stock almost slot into his shoulder pad, as if they were made for each other. Perhaps because they were.
When we face the Endbreach, pull back on this lever. It will slot in the Blackfire charge and prime it.
He checked the console and dismounted his station.
We will man the lower port. Warriors will serve with us. Do not let them get all the glory. We gunners have given fire to more than they ever will, and we deserve fire just as much, if not more, than they do. What do we do to fire?
The newbie asked. Dugresh considered the question, and then held up the weapon.
Squeeze this, but you only have 20 shots. After that, you will not be able to give them any more fire. But charge gloriously, and...
The thrusters engaged, cutting Dugresh off. He steadied himself on a railing. Once the ship stabilized, he indicated the lower grav chute.
To battle, my fellow squogg. To battle, and to fire. To an end we all deserve.
Why not take one's own life? Why let the rot have the chance? If squogg society was built on dying, then why wait? Because death without cause was meaningless. As meaningless as the rot. Because death, not in the service of Blackfleet, was a death wasted. And Gudradd desired one thing above death. It was glory for Blackfleet. Glory for the true home he'd never seen. The warrior squogg in the portroom hangar area was wearing an overskin. Metal plates over a black polymer crust. Their black lances linked up to barrels on their backs, carrying more blackfire. They'd get more than 20 shots, but that was their right. Gudradd had been responsible for killing countless humans through his prime charges. The warriors now had their turn, and Gudradd would fight alongside them, and he couldn't believe it. Death. It was in his grasp, the promise to all squogg that the pain would end, that they'd no longer feel their skin peeling off, their flesh wilting, and their limbs collapsing. It would end. The misery, the waiting, the cold and callous life where their bodies desire nothing but each other's touch, but they have to be content with the embrace of amber goo and cold metal coffins. Blackfleet was letting him die. Finally, the Endbreach approached.
Respirators!
An officer shouted. Dugresh, Gudradd, and the others were hooked up with masks that would let them survive the lack of nitrogen oxide that would result after a breach. Suffocation was not glorious. They needed to pierce the human shell, to charge into the breach, to give fire before taking their own.
Warpram in 5!
The officer yelled. Everybody grabbed onto a railing. Gudradd watched through the surveillance console. The cold death was facing a human battleship. The battleship that had ambushed them from behind that gas giant. Frigates in the distance skirmished with rearguard Black Fleet destroyers.
4,
Gudradd held onto his black lance.
3,
Dugresh remembered his father.
2,
The newbie couldn't believe his fortune that, after only his second skin, he was to die.
1.
Gudradd felt warp speed, and suddenly the jolt of impact as the dreadnought caved into the battleship, breaking through its shields and hull and splitting the vessel almost in two. Grav claws hooked onto the remains of the battleship, pressing them to the dreadnought's flank. Both ships were out of commission, but that didn't matter. This was their mutual grave.
We die here today,
The Warmaster yelled. Gudradd turned to see a large squogg, larger than the rest, appear carrying a thick-barreled black lance.
Give them fire, give them death, take everything, and do not let the rot win.
The united squogg let out a deafening bleating. Tigron's warble was not present, only the uniform beeping. But it carried so much more than before. It carried a finality and utter joy that only Endbreach could bring. The port doors opened, scraping into the bent hull of the battleship.
Charge!
The Warmeister yelled, and the tide of squogg filled the breach. Suffocated and annihilated corpses of humans covered the white and silver rooms of the battleship. Like a dream, Gudradd entered, trudging over shrapnel. Dugresh died first. A human, puny and shorter than any squogg, wearing red and black, opened fire and let loose a volley of red-hot shells that annihilated Dugresh's face through his respirator and underskin. A warrior fired the black lance, letting loose a trail of black powder and crackling fire that left a fist-sized hole in the human's chest. Gudradd saw more humans further down the halls of the ship, and he fired. The jolt to his arms was unexpected, and he almost dropped his weapon. Human munitions catapulted toward them, hitting warriors' armor and impacting with crewmen, releasing trails of amber fluid and black blood. Black fire eviscerated the human defenders down the hall. Gudradd walked over their corpses, looking this way and that for someone to kill. He glanced feet, running away. He followed them. Some warriors and crewmen with him. A human fired 2 shots off before Gudradd managed to release another cataclysmic shot his way. The shot splattered an odd red liquid all over the hall. Such peculiar creatures. The next room led him to the retreating humans. They held no weapons. Gudradd felt disappointment. What if there were too many of these unarmed humans? They wouldn't be able to give him fire. Deserving or not, Gudradd leveled his black lance at the cowering humans and squeezed the trigger. Their exposed flesh was torn apart, and they stopped cowering. 17 shots left. Gudradd turned around, 2 crewmen dead. The warriors were fighting a squad of humans. Gudradd fired, again and again. Smoke and black fire powder filled the room, marring his vision. He didn't know how many humans he killed, only that none hit him. The smoke cleared, and they proceeded. He walked over the corpse of the Warmeister and the newbie. The newbie's skull was cracked. The Warmeister's leg had been torn off. He had finally been given fire, at long last.
Crewman,
A warrior gutturally spoke to him. Gudradd turned. The warrior was covered in red.
follow us. There is a second breach by a smaller human ship. We are to board it.
Gudradd bleated. He had not died yet, but not many squoggs received 2 Endbreaches, especially in one awakening. They arrived at the edge of the breach. Squogg fired volleys of black fire into a line of defending humans, cowering behind cover and letting loose enticing volley upon volley of munitions. Gudradd resisted charging head-on without the others.
Are you ready, crewman?
The warrior asked. Gudradd bleated. Shrapnel tore into Gudradd's center unit. He could no longer smell the iron and fiery discharge of the Blackfire cannons. He was encased only in his own stench, the reminder of his inevitable death. Fitting, for every squogg was doomed to die. The only choice they had was how, and better by fire than rot, always. And so Gudradd charged into the breach, weapon in hand. Rot was all he smelled. Smoke, ash, and the blast of human munitions was all he saw. And he heard an end. Promised to him. Promised to all squogg. Rot or fire. He had chosen fire. The warrior fell in a heap. More died as rapid fire from the humans ended them. Gudradd fired again and again, until his black lance was spent. He held it like a club and entered the breach. A human showing the whites of its eyes had its skull caved in by his black lance stock. He turned on another, and then felt the searing and fortunate pain of metal pierce his underskin, and then his flesh. It was here. Death. Fire. Oh, glory. He fell to his knees and accepted his end. But it didn't come. More squogg charged into the breach, but his vision didn't blacken. Panic set into him. It was his place to die. Where was the black? Where was the fire? Then he felt pain, a dull, throbbing ache in his hands. He looked down and saw that the underskin had been torn from his hands, revealing his graying, sickly flesh, barely coated anymore in the embalmed fluid, and his skin was peeling off. The rot. He stood, feeling his heart beat faster than any time before. He charged into the breach without his weapon. He needed to die. He had to. It was promised. Squogg lay dead by his feet, but not him. His flesh was falling off in bits, and the flagging artificial gravity let it float away.
Kill me!
He screamed, his voice breaking. His transmitter had been damaged. Or was it the rot? Humans in black and red saw him and opened fire. They missed and stopped firing. He collapsed in front of them and yelled in his guttural speech.
Kill me! Don't let me rot! Please, let me die!
They didn't level their weapons at him. Instead, a human wearing a red cross over a white circle applied a roll of fabric over his rotting arms.
No!
He screamed, struggling.
Kill me! Give me fire! I want it to end! Not like this! Not like this!
Two humans lifted him up, aided by the gravity switching off. They pulled him along as he screamed, not for mercy, but a swift and fiery end. The one promised to him, and promised to all squogg who served Black Fleet.
Please kill me. Anything but rot. Please, let me die. I need to die. The end.
He was dragged into a well-lit portion of the smaller vessel, attached to the slain battleship. He felt himself becoming lighter as his flesh rotted away. Did he still have his arms? What would go next? No, he couldn't let it end this way. He tried to grasp at a human's odd-shaped weapon, but all he saw was the stumps of his arms. He turned back and saw his arms floating in the distance. They were crumbling, like him. He screamed and yelled, bagging his legs against the platform that the humans placed him on. More humans wearing red crosses came up to him. One yelled at the other in garbled and incomprehensible alien speak. Taken aback, the one from before helped the new Red Cross wearer apply, No, not that. Embalm fluid was applied to his exposed sections, and then sealant patches placed over them. He wasn't going to die. After 2 Endbreaches, he wasn't being given his fire. Why, humans? Why do this? Why be so cruel? Gudradd let you die. He gave you an honorable death. Why let him suffer so? Let him die. Put a munition in his forehead. Give him fire.
Please.
Gudradd whimpered. The ship jolted, and the artificial gravity kicked in again. Gudradd felt the ship drift away. He turned and stared out of a window. The cold death was nestled deeply into the human ship. He saw fires through some of the portholes, and he was being taken away from it. Taken away in some sort of prison ship. Gudradd didn't think of what the humans had planned for him. He only felt a bitter sense of emptiness after his transmitter was too broken for him to be able to scream any longer. He was pushed into a cell. A human, his mask off and flesh now exposed, stared at Gudradd. He spoke in a comprehensible but pale mockery of squogg. "I would have killed you." The tone held anger and malice. But why? Gudradd wanted to die. Was this human angry at his superiors? Gudradd tried to beg him to do so, but his voice was hoarse and couldn't escape his underskin without a working transmitter. The cell door was shut, and Gudradd was alone. He stared at his stumps. The ship was humming, preparing for warp jump. He wasn't dead. Some squogg had tear ducts still. Gudradd did not. But if he had, then he would have flooded his underskin. Fire or rot. He had been promised either, but gotten neither. He peered out the porthole, at the battle he had been stolen from. In a blink, it disappeared, and was replaced by the void. Gudradd took solace in this blackness of space, for it is the blackness he had been promised before, and for now, he could pretend it was his, and he had finally reached his end. "Why did we save it, Sergeant?" the trooper asked. He had pale skin. Underworlder, probably. Or a shipborne. His kinetic plate was scorched by the squogg munitions. He'd need to get the right shoulder plate replaced when they made planetfall. The sergeant didn't respond. He was looking over the casualty report. His squad had got off lightly. The fleet lost 2 companies completely. Not a single survivor. These insane aliens didn't care about their own lives. They would sacrifice as many as it took to take down a single human ship. "Because it doesn't deserve to die," the sergeant responded. "Sir?" the trooper began, his pale face reddening with outrage. The sergeant raised his hand to silence the newbie trooper. "Things aren't that simple, Private, and they never are. We fight Black Fleet today, we fight alongside them tomorrow. And while they may be obsessed with death and have little value for their own lives, we have a use for them." The trooper looked incredulous. The sergeant sighed. "The squogg is going back to Mars. The boys in white want to take a look at him." "Experimentation? What for?" "To end their plague. Because if they aren't going to rot away, maybe they'll become more like us. And maybe then we can stop fighting them." The trooper scowled. "They'll never be like us." "You think so?" The sergeant looked up at the white light of the ship's hallway as it engaged its second warp jump. "It's worth a shot, don't you think?" They secured their straps for the jump. The sergeant looked at the casualty report again and thought to himself that even if the aliens wouldn't change, at least things couldn't get worse. Endbreach by Nicholas Woode-Smith. Performed by Scott Miller. Produced by Citadel Studios for Sentinel Creatives.